sort out screen sharing. There we go. You're sharing your screen. Are you? No, you're not seeing the right one, are you?
Yes. I'm singing Camera Creative.
Oh, you are. Okay, fine. Normally has a band, a coloured band around it, but we're all good.
That looks good, Steve.
Fantastic. Well, firstly, thanks to Jeff and the committee team for inviting me to do this evening. It's always enjoyable, always forces me to go out and do some research and take some photographs. This has been probably the most challenging evening / talk that I've done, really, especially with particularly with lockdown, because I'm conscious that given we are all in lockdown, I can hardly suggest you go out and take this safari photograph, you know, in preparation for the competition. So in Camera Creative, thankfully, gives me a lot of scope to be able to talk about different aspects of the topic. So I do want to kick off with what do we mean by in Camera Creative? And so I had a chat with Jeff when we sort of kicked off the idea, and I've had a chat with Eddie since. And we also, I'm also aware of who the judge is, and so what I've got here is I've got a kind of definition of in Camera Creative, and I'm going to look at areas where special techniques are used, and examples of that are multiple exposures, camera movement, long exposures. But I'm also going to look at areas where you don't need special techniques. For those of you that don't feel confident in doing that type of thing, and also given our lockdown, maybe scope to do some of this stuff is a little more difficult. And then we've concocted the idea that we might share this presentation with the judge, so the judge gets an idea of what you guys have seen. So there's some kind of overlap between, you know, this preparation at least, and the way the evening may be judged. So bearing all that in mind, we're doing our best just to work in that kind of direction. So what is allowed in Camera Creative in terms of special techniques is using your camera to do multiple exposures, doing intentional camera movement, and doing long exposures. Your camera will give you ways and means to do these things, and in some cases overlap them and do multiple exposures with ICM or long exposures with ICM. And why is that allowed? Because basically you're in control of the creativity. You make all the decisions about what you're going to photograph and how, and length of exposures and all those sort of things. What is not allowed is camera preset profiles and art filters, which and the reason for that is because the camera is doing the creative work and not the photographer, fundamentally. Obviously in Camera Creative is supposed to be avoiding us working on Photoshop and any other Lightroom and other post-processing packages, which do, if we push those packages, allow us to do some fairly creative things. But it doesn't stop us doing dodging and burning, taking raw photographs into, you know, saturating them properly, sharpening, putting appropriate amount of contrast into your photographs. There's no reason that the club is asking that you don't do that and you just have something straight out of your camera. It's not that sort of clinical. So hopefully that gives you an idea of that. And I'm sure Jeff or Eddie or anybody would answer any questions on this subject at the end of the evening, which we'll allow time for. So what I'd like to do is kick off with everybody just getting a sort of state of mind here. I think you should think of in-camera creative as out-of-camera creative. And that's because the real place where the creativity happens is with you and not with the camera. So if we're going to be creative in our photography, I think we've got to think about how we are creative and what we can achieve in different circumstances in different ways, rather than thinking in-camera creative is something that you're going to turn a setting on your camera and create something interesting from. So let's start with that sort of basic parameter. And so I really want to share here a list of potential ways in which you can get creative in your mind and with your camera as a tool that doesn't use special techniques like long exposures that require ND filters and multiple exposures. If by some chance you do not have a camera that takes multiple exposures, then obviously that would be a challenge. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about creative use of depth of field, color abstraction, camera angles, close-ups, light, shadows, patterns, different styles of work. I'm going to do a little section on lenses because whilst I'm not going to cover all lens types, obviously the lens you use takes you in a certain direction and style of work. And so we're going to look at that. And there's a particular session which I don't think I've seen before at the club. So I thought I might do this as a kind of new area and show you what you can do with some vintage lenses by taking whatever your digital camera might be and or your film camera, and quite cheaply you can invest in some into some standard vintage lenses, and with a fairly cheap adapter you can put them onto your digital cameras and create some interesting work. And we'll look at things like minimalism and graininess and things like that. So this isn't going to be heavily technical tonight, but there's some areas where you can explore special techniques that we've all seen in the past. So I'm going to kick off with wishing you all a belated Merry Christmas, and we've done the Happy New Year, and suggest maybe it's time to get your Christmas lights out again. If you haven't yet put them back in the loft, because we're gonna kick off with a session that is going to talk about depth of field and the creative use of depth of field, and the first area of that is bokeh, and the creativity we can create with our cameras and with bokeh. Now, if I go into my arsenal of lenses, and I appreciate not, everyone's going to have a different range of cameras and lenses and everything else. But one objective, if you're going to try to do some work with shallow depth of field and with bokeh, is to find a fast lens with like f1.2, 1.8, 2.8, something down at that region. And potentially something like a portrait lens. So using the Fuji system in the main, I have access to a f1.2 56mm, and that is at full frame equivalent, an 85mm lens. And so with an 85mm lens, you can start to, and an f1.2 lens, you can completely push the background out of focus, and you can play with what is actually in focus and out of focus. And so one thing I'm going to encourage you to do in this context of bokeh, but also in context of other photography, is don't be afraid to take your photographs completely out of focus. If I like I like soft focus, and obviously you can create soft focus in the sense of something that is in focus but is soft, with various techniques, but also you can take photographs that are out of focus, and that achieves certain things. And here's an example with some Christmas lights being used, and also what's really important when you look at this type of work is you'll notice it's very, very simple. There is something in the background. There is a hue of blue reflecting in something else in the background. And so you have got decisions to make around, do you have a clinical kind of light source and everything in the background is black? Or do you have some kind of context in the background which is sympathetic to your foreground? And I think there's some interesting decisions there to make. And whilst I'm not going to sit on this photograph for the whole evening, I do want to make a point here about key lines. Obviously, we're now in a world of digital presentations rather than our prints. And if you're going to use a lot of photography with light and you can have some dark backgrounds like you have with this, then a key line is pretty useful to frame the image. And one little technique I'd just like to give you as an option is when you put your typically 1 pixel key line around your image, you can actually, as you know, you can color the key line. This key line is mid-gray rather than white. And when you use a white one, which is a tendency on black work, it can be quite stark and take your eye away from the content. So if you like this slightly, if you like, off-white key line, go select a mid-gray, and against the black it will still stand out and will keep your eye concentrated in the center. Coming to sort of more real life stuff, obviously if you do get out to your local you know, ponds or lakes or parks that you might be able to travel to, or you have some imagery from the summer, the combination of background bokeh using a shallow depth of field, and this would have been taken with a longer lens than an 85 mil, probably a 7200 sort of equivalent at sort of 200 or 300 as the field of view, and then you can really isolate your subject, create some beautiful bokeh, and also, you know, you've got this kind of real nice light coming through if you get into the right situation with light. So if you're going to play,
Steve,
yeah.
can I just ask you about this mysterious word bokeh? I don't know anything about it.
Oh yeah, fair question. Thanks for the question. So bokeh is the roundish circles of light that are out of focus that you see in the background on the image. So if I go back to here, these circles are individual points of light that are either a light, in this case it's a Christmas tree light, but it could be something reflecting off of the leaves of a tree, or point sources of light, reflection in water or off a building or some guttering. It could be anything. Whenever you get a point source of light and your camera is out of focus for that plane of where that item is, you create these round circles of glow in the background, and that is what's called bokeh, and it comes from a Japanese word. And I'm going to forget. I'm sure somebody can remember exactly what the translation is, but it is a kind of like a light source, light area.
Bokeh means fog, I think, in Japanese, and it generally can be used to talk about the lights, as you're saying, but also just the general out of focus background. But the light points do form the dappling effect that you're describing, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Randall. Yeah, so there is it comes from Japan as a word, and the most common use of it is that, as you can see behind these flamingos, is these circles of light. But it's also, as Randall says, the general out of focus area, and the importance of that is that that background is sympathetic to the foreground. And one of the dangers is over sharpening it. When you're sharpening to get the eyes sharp on these flamingos, for example, if you do a general sharpening, you sharpen your soft bokeh and it starts to look jagged and ugly and like JPEG artifacts in it. So that's something just to be really, really careful about. But there's a couple of examples of bokeh and something creative from this kind of straight form of photography. Now, as I said in the introduction, there's a number of ways you can work on this effect and get some very sort of some interesting creative input. It's relatively cheap to buy some manual vintage lenses off eBay. Now, it's something you need to do a bit of research on as to what you're looking for, because different lenses can do different things. And typically you will need an adapter from what's called M42, M39. So this is stuff that would have attached to a Leica or some vintage cameras and sort of Minoltas and Pentaxes and that back in the day and etc. But these adapters are very cheap. You know, it's an expensive one if it costs you £20. So you don't need to spend that sort of money, and you can get it for all sorts of mounts. I buy for Fuji mount. So here, for example, I'm using a Jupiter 8 50mm f2 lens, which came on the front of an old Zorky Russian eBay camera I bought for tens of pounds. And take that off that camera, put an M49 converter onto my Fuji, and now you have a Russian Moscow built back in the 30s to 50s or whatever sort of era to create creative photography with. And each of these, I'm going to show you a number of them now, and just to be clear that I don't have this addiction to huge addiction, at least, to buying multiple vintage lenses. I raided my brother's cupboard, and he's sent me some photographs of using his ones, and he and I between us have a few. So yeah, between us we've managed to pull up a few images with different lenses for you, and they have different styles and different ways in which you can use it. Now, these lenses also have these interesting little logos that you see on the slide here, and from those logos you can actually tell which Russian lens work and location the lens was made. And there is various qualities of factory, and so if you buy from the better quality factories, you get better lenses, but sometimes better doesn't mean better bokeh, because a poor lens sometimes gives you artifacts in the way the lens is ground and built that gives you more interesting bokeh than a good lens. So that's just something to be aware of as potentially if you have a look at it. And so if you, as I say, getting your Christmas lights out, if anybody in your streets still have their lights out, wandering around over the Christmas period, I was able to collect a number of images. And what I want to point out to you on this particular shot is the sky, to be honest. It's the Jupiter 8 gives you a relatively nice round point of light here, but also gives you this really interesting kind of dappling in the background sky, because as the light source gets further away and interplays with the shadows, you get this kind of much more sort of swirly thing going on to create some quite interesting effects with a fairly cheap lens. Yeah, and here's another shot just to give you some ideas of what you might be able to do. And then if you're stuck indoors and you think, well, how can I do some of this with the lights away? Then, you know, get into the still life side of things. Have a look at some objects you have in the house. Have a look at some, you know, as you can see, these are like sticks of light that people potentially have in their houses that are not necessarily Christmas orientated. There's lots of different ways of creating these light sources and then putting a few things out and creating effectively some still lives. So yeah, it's just some ideas. And this particular Jupiter 3 f1.5 comes from a Zagorsk factory rather than the Moscow factory that we saw earlier on. And just talking about shapes of bokeh, this particular lens gives you, the Jupiter 9, gives you these little circles on the outside, the circumference of the bokeh, in much more stronger way than the other lenses do. And there's even one called a bubble bokeh, where you get these significantly bigger bubbles of bokeh in it. And that's another lens, which you can do some YouTube research and work out if any of these are particularly interesting to you and you like the style. The highest quality of these Russian lenses comes from the Minsk Belomo factories, which is the Belarus area of Russia, or what was Russia. This particular lens, the Helios, it's the 44-2 with the logo that you see here, is very, very well known for this really swirly kind of background bokeh. And as you can see here, everything seems to be picked up. If you get the light right, everything gets picked up in the light and starts to dance around in the back of your image. So this is interesting creative work. One thing I will say about the whole presentation tonight is I'm not necessarily going to be able to show you award-winning 10 out of 10 images on every topic, obviously. So to some degree, it is about, can you use the technique? Can you use the idea? This is all about the ideas we can create, then to turn that into something that's going to win you your 10s and get you the Master of Photography title. But other than that, if you don't quite have that ambition, there's a significant amount of interesting creative work you can do, and build yourself up a portfolio of this type of work. And again, you can see here in the background the interesting long way out of focus. And there's no particular light source in this one apart from the sky, but you do get this rather interesting matrix of light and shadow going on in the blue areas up in the sky, and that's because of the lens and the way it works. Here's a bit of typical flower photography. Again, using the Helios 44-2. This one my brother took. And just to again point out, the point of this shot is the bokeh you see in the background, the greenery, and the way it kind of, these lenses tend to swirl their bokeh rather differently to the Fuji f2, which is a modern high quality lens, whatever, 10 times the price of this stuff, and it gives you that different effect.
Steve?
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit about the shape of the bokeh? Because I presume that all these pictures are taken at full aperture. So can you say a bit about what happens if you stop down, particularly with some of these old cheap lenses with just a small number of diaphragms in the aperture, and the sort of shapes you get if you do that?
Yeah, okay, good. It's a good question. I haven't particularly demonstrated that point, but it's a great question. So when you look at these type of lenses, one of the things is the diaphragm and the number of blades that you get in the diaphragm that stops down. The higher number of blades, let's say if you're going 10 or 12 blades, 8, 9, 10, 12 blades, you get a much more ability to create a circle in your aperture. Because if you can imagine, how do you create the aperture that the light comes through? If you're closing down the blades of your shutter, what happens is that's made up of straight lines. each one is a straight line, unless the lens is designed with curved blades, which some have. The lower number you have, the more you end up with a hexagon, if you like, of say 5 blades to create what is trying to be your circle that your aperture is reducing down to. And to Phil's point, setting certain depth of field and certain aperture sizes, you can get these bokeh turn into hexagons and octagons and polygons of whatever number of blades you've got, and you do start to get that effect. And I think sometimes on certain subjects, let's say you're taking architectural work, and that's the main topic, then a hexagonal or octagonal piece of bokeh, i.e. a group of these circles in the background, might just work for the fact you've got straight lines on your buildings. But I would say overall, that's a novelty that you might see one and think, oh, that's interesting. But once you really get into this and you're doing portraiture and you're doing nature, which is common, and coastal work and everything else, the circular bokeh is the one that's much more commonly kind of comfortable to look at, aesthetically strong, and creates the nicer overall effect. But yeah, so you should do, if you're interested in buying some of these lenses, please do your research. I can certainly share some links should anyone want them, because there are tens of lenses recommended for doing this from all sorts of brands, and many of them have different effects and different styles of bokeh that you can work with, some of which are more, esoteric and perhaps a bit of a novelty than others. So you're there, you need to make your choices. So good question. Hopefully that answered it for you, Phil.
Yeah, thank you.
If I miss anything, I'm very happy someone to jump in. Okay, so that was just that was one area. Let's just carry on with depth of field for a moment. So I want to talk about subject isolation, because that's what depth of field gives you. And obviously, the simple, shallow depth of field is creative, and we can create this lovely soft effect in the background. But I'm going to suggest it won't win many prizes, because we see a lot of this kind of work as it is. So if you're going to try to do something with depth of field and sort of subject isolation, try and add some additional components to it. This isn't a particularly great photograph, I will say, but the colors are nice, and it is somewhat seasonal. And so if you're adding sort of seasonal components alongside softness and creativity, I think that adds value to the photograph and as another layer. And of course, if you can get nice light and you can add a strong sense of color palette to it as well, you end up with seasonality, you end up with the red-green color palette thing going, and you've also got your softness in the background, and suddenly this comes to life a bit more. So if you're going to go down the bokeh route with your creativity and you want to get as creative as possible, yeah, you need to experiment with subjects, color, nature of your depth of field, and a few other things, or else you will end up with a nice remark from the judge, but probably not the kind of score you're looking for the top marks. Well, so while we're on the subject of lenses, I think we would go amiss if we didn't talk about macro lenses. And one of the things about macro lenses that is really interesting is they are very, very creative in my view, or they can be used creatively, because they take you into a world that you can't see with the naked eye. And if you are able to build imagery with color patterns, and the macro lens takes you into that world, then I think you're onto an interesting thing. And I think this is another area and angle where you can get some real creativity going. This is this is an image I've used before where you pick out a particular area for sharpness. You have some rather shapely, angular bokeh going on in the background, and an overall softness to the image, which is fairly nice and fairly creative. But I do think that in this day and age, this is probably not going to crack it in terms of real creativity. Again, because it's very pleasant. It can be well executed. I think you have to go further, like more like this, where you really say, okay, I'm going to get really close up now. You're not going to really know what it is you're looking at in terms of, you probably can't identify the flower, but you still know what it is because you see these stamen, and you're being very, very bold with your colors and kind of where you're taking the viewer. So I think this is more the way to go. The more you can push your use of a lens, be it what we did earlier or this type of macro, the more you can push the lens and take us somewhere new, I think the more. Sheena Rogers is doing the judging, and I think she's brave enough and understands creativity enough in order to understand what you're doing if you put an image like this in, which could get highly criticized by a judge that doesn't appreciate creativity, and may well get criticized for various reasons for one that does. But I just want to take you in that direction. So don't forget, if you're going in this direction to do creative work around macro lenses, don't forget your lighting. You must think about flash, reflectors, fixed lighting, because the closer you get, the more the light is really, really important, because you're going to get that translucency through the petals, or light reflecting off elements that you're photographing. The lighting is really, really important to get a finished item. And I would say the more extreme you can go, the more you're going to trigger the sense of creativity with the judge. I know Monica will remember from many years ago when I was doing my LRPS and turned up with some of these images to put into my LRPS. We had that great debate about, yeah, it's too brave. They might think you don't know how to focus your camera. And so and that was great advice. And we didn't go there.
And they
Yeah.
didn't accept it, no.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I think when we're putting something in for a judge and it's about creativity, I think this is exactly where you should go, or one of your choices as to where you should go. Okay, so patterns. While we're on flowers, obviously nature provides some rather beautiful colors and patterns for us. And so this is an option to look at this sort of very abstract sort of pattern type photography. I would just suggest, though, that this particular shot, it would be quite a brave competition entry, because it is so simple. And there are questions. I mean, if you look at this photograph, the center is pretty in focus, but the edges are out. And you are opening up the question, should this be all in focus? Is the depth of field too shallow here? And if this is a flat plane, you could have got everything, I could have got everything in focus. So you are opening up to some subjectivity depending on how you do these things. So one thing I would say is, if you're doing macro work and you're doing this type of work, be very purposeful about what you have in focus and what you don't, and be very self-critical when you've done your photograph and you think, I like this, this is simple, this has got, something about it on color or whatever you're doing. Be quite critical about your plane of focus. And so that means when you're taking these photographs, do some focus bracketing, do some work to see what it looks like completely in focus, what it looks like a little bit out of focus around the edges, etc., etc. And remember that we're not supposed to be getting our Lightroom defocusing and vignetting tools out, at least in an obvious way, because of the nature of this topic being in camera. So then if you're going to do this type of work, maybe this is the way to go. Maybe it's identifying structures and patterns and styles and shapes that are sitting in nature, and then you take that very plain single palette into something a little bit more dynamic, and you can identify, you know, these kind of shapes and patterns. And one thing I've said a number of times, and I think holds fairly true, is the trick on a pattern image is where you break the pattern in your image so that you have something that is a point of focus for the eye to travel to and contrast the kind of general patterning in the photograph. And of course you can play more and more with, oh, there we go, wasn't working for a second. You can play more and more with how the light comes through and how you use the light within these patterns, which is why I said earlier, the lighting in this type of photograph is really, really important. You either want it potentially completely flat, so you have a democratic kind of luminosity that means you are able to, it's the lines and shapes and that are drawing people's eye, or you're using the light to do that, and the light is taking you to where you want the viewer to look across your image. And you've got this contrast of light and shade going on. I think Eddie, Jeff and I all agreed that there is no issue in this competition with choosing to do black and white and or choosing color. But obviously we're not looking for you know, a lot of post-production or any particular post-production sort of changes of hue and color in any major way, which is the topic of this of your photograph. So transitioning with the conversation around light, I actually want to, I mean, we all know how important light is in terms of creativity and in terms of photography. But in terms of being creative here, I want to play tonight a little bit on shadows, because I could probably, we could have a whole evening talking about photographs with great light, and I don't think great light on its own is necessarily the creative thing. Sometimes it can be. So I'm gonna show you now 5 different ways to use shadows in a creative way. Or each of which are not necessarily star images, but at least give you an idea of how this works. So the first one is perhaps your standard way of showing a shadow, which is the shadow, you know, reflects down on an object that is lighter than the shadow, and you're going to see the shadow, you know, on a wall or on a pathway, or in this case, in water. So this is one way of creating a shadow. And I think if you're going to go in this direction, the shadow's got to be interesting. There's got to be something else about it, because obviously this is the straight shadow that we would typically see. But there is stuff you can do here. The second way of showing a shadow is the shadow is actually the relief from the light, being, in this case, you know, the recess or the inset on this particular shot. And so yeah, if you're going to do that, I'm a proponent of keeping things really, really simple, and I'm going to do a very small section on minimalism, I think in the second half. And I think this would fall into that. This is minimalist, made up of very simple things. You've got to be very careful about your angles and how things work. I think you've either got to make it very symmetrical and be very, very careful that your lines line up, or you've got to make everything off. And everything is off on this image. Nothing's quite straight. And therefore, nothing could be criticized as being that line is a bit off, because everything's off. So when you're working on architecture, which is obviously an interesting topic for us all, because that's the first evening of the Masters competition, be very, very careful about your geometry of lines in architecture. And with creativity, we can use everything being off and being simple, and use of shadows like this in an interesting and creative way. And then you cross your fingers that the judge agrees with me and sees it that way as well, which isn't necessarily the case. In the road between the Victoria Wine Warehouse and actually Martina's house and the club, and you go through Leatherhead, there's a BP garage. And stopping there for petrol on the way to a camera club evening one evening, I came across this site of a house with I have no idea what's going on behind those rather interesting orange windows, but I just knew it was an interesting photograph, at least a snapshot. And I think snapshots can be quite creative and quite interesting. And I think creating some kind of intrigue and engagement with your user about your viewer about what we're looking at is a way to create some curiosity, which means engagement on your image and makes the image stand out in some way. You've got to be very careful not to make such a subject or such an image too obscure that someone can't work out quite what it is. But here the whole image is in shade, and it's only the lights coming out acting as the relief to the shade, which is the opposite way around to what we've just looked at. So this is another way of thinking about your creativity is just having something coming out of your image, very sort of in the background, but strong enough to create a point. Probably quite a difficult thing to do, and I'm not going to claim this would do particularly well, but it's a good example of the approach. The other thing that we always see with shadows as well is, things that are everyday but quite boring in reality. The shadow of that item in the right light with the right textures becomes something quite interesting and intriguing. So I really do like this type of photograph where you've got some sand and what I think is some sand and some objects with some light. And this is going to be handheld, and this is going to have some camera movement in it. So you've created some combination here of texture, of light and shade, shape, that you're trying to work out what's going on, whether it be multiple exposure, bit of camera movement. And if I don't say it again this evening, it deserves saying multiple times across a lot of the work we're looking at tonight. If you layer one technique over another, you almost create this additional level of creativity. So overlaying camera movement with shadows, overlaying multiple exposures with macro, overlaying something else, just layers more and more interesting opportunities for creative work and rather wonderful outcomes. So a lot of trial and error, a lot of practice to master it sometimes. But it does create some interesting work. And just a final thing on shadows or shadows of light. Obviously, if you I don't work with models and do much posing, but on one of our camera club outings, we went down to, and someone's going to remember, I think this is Lyme Regis. These girls were standing looking out to sea, not quite like this, just in a typical teenage huddle. And they were quite happy when I said, would you mind lining up against the horizon and I'm going to take your photograph? And after a bit of giggling, they did. And yeah, this was the result. So yeah, there's some interesting things you can do. And this concept of contre-jour, where you shoot into the light and the objects in the foreground therefore become dark. Obviously, you've got choices about how much you open up the shadows here, as I've done to a degree, so you can see their clothing, or you can leave it as silhouettes. So this again is another approach that you might be interested in taking. And I'm just gonna finish this section off with not something I particularly suggest you do, but obviously working with landscapes and sunrises and sunsets. The creative use of these lights is most times when we go and see a sunset, it looks wonderful. When we photograph it, it doesn't quite look as good. But there are cases where you can get some rather fantastic coloring and interesting elements to the light to work with, and you can make things look fairly dramatic. So yeah, I think we have to have a think about how creative these are, but I just thought I'd share those with you. Right, I'm going to do one more section and then we're going to go into our break. Camera angles. I think camera angles is a really interesting area to work with, and sometimes creating this kind of artificial camera angle does encourage people to have a look at it and move their head from right to left and think about what is it you've done. And one thing I would say, if you're going to try this out, obviously the subject matter makes a difference. The more you can take away their context. If we go back to this one, you can see the kind of hedgerow in the background and possibly some buildings at the top. But the more you take that out of the image, almost the more acceptable the camera angle change becomes. So that's something really worth playing with and thinking about. Removing that context can take away some of the jarring elements of what is unacceptable about inventing this camera angle here, which is completely, artificial. And also notice what's going on in the bokeh here in the background. I actually can't remember how I processed this, but you've got these kind of rings around the poppy heads. And typically I'm careful about not over processing stuff. So this may well be a combination of the kind of light sitting on the flower heads and the bokeh, and creating these rings around the bokeh with the lens I've used. And look, just to give you some very, obviously we all know how to do this, but abstracted elements out of a scene, low angles are more interesting than standard ones. Looking up at buildings, creating exaggerated perspectives. There's an element of creativity here. I think there's some value in some of this work, and maybe also the overlap into the architectural stuff. Using framing techniques to take your subject and frame them in a creative way is an interesting way to work, and there's different things you can do with that. And then you can get, the context of even the statues are wondering what the government's doing with COVID these days. So you can bring in some contextual angles which join things together in different ways that typically you wouldn't see them, and change the meaning of your photograph. And I think there's definitely an angle for creativity there. And there's one more photograph later on I'm going to show you about creative context being the reason you're a way of shooting. And yeah, so the last one on this section is, you're able to pick out elements in your image, and suddenly size becomes a very different thing. So footprints in the sand become have a kind of different context if you photograph them in this way. So I think it's a good time to take 10-15 minute break and come back for the second half. Perfect. So can everyone see my last image?
Perfectly.
Very good. That's,
Yeah.
That was start.
Okay.
Excuse me, starting at the right place. Okay, so one of the build components of this evening's, by the advertisement, I mean, for the evening, was that Steve would run through ICM long exposures and multiple exposures. So here is a kind of cut down section on ICM, intentional camera movement. For those people that didn't manage to see the talk a year or so back. And secondly, is a kind of little bit of a reminder to everybody. And also to show a little bit of new work. So the principle is on intentional camera movement. We take a scene, and this is a typical Norfolk beach scene. Again, another real fun camera club outing. And then we introduce our camera movement to it. And this particular movement is a left to right, or right to left, whatever you want to do, horizontal swipe of your camera. And the particular technique you need to work on is the speed at which you move your camera across, related to the level of detail that you have in your image and the focal length of your image. And I'm not going to go into all the different pros and cons of that tonight. That was part of the previous talk, but with bits of experimentation, you can work out that different speeds give you different textures in your image, and that's important to your final result. The place to start is whatever is the most common or eye-catching directional angle in your photograph. Like in this example, it's the horizon of the sea and the edge of the stones or sand on the beach. If that is horizontal, then you should be swiping horizontal. If I've got trees in front of me which are vertical, I should be swiping vertically. And that will, as a kickoff, gives you the most aesthetically pleasing kind of, because everything is aligned, and the alignment gives you this nice sort of textures and banding and things that help with the aesthetics of your photograph. You can then start to break those rules by saying, okay, I've got a horizontal horizon here, but what happens if I swipe diagonally? And you can start to see what happens. You start to get a blending of one color set into the next. You start to get a rough edge or a softened edge, depending on the textures, in between your solid components of your photograph. And you start to get some of this sort of very soft, hazy wispiness, in this case, going on in the sky. So you can start to see what happens when you go against the trend of the alignment of the objects of your image here. And it's then all about experimentation as to A, how does it look? B, what kind of look are you trying to get? Are you trying to get painterly? Are you trying to get texture? Are you trying to get smoothness? Is your photograph about shape and objects, or is it about color? What's the raison d'etre on your image? And that's where you're expressing your creativity. So here, vertical swipe with vertical subject matter. We have, you know, yachts and in the harbour, and the masts and sails, most of which in this context were wrapped around the mast and not sort of fully out. Then the vertical swipe gives you the most sense of structure in the final image. And if we look at a tiptrich of 3 trees, on the left hand side we've got some vertical swiping going on, but there is a little bit of staging in the movements. We've gone down, then we've stopped, and we've gone down, and we've stopped, and we've gone down, and we've stopped. And you get this context of layered textures coming into your photograph on the left hand side. In the middle image, we've got a movement which is, you know, move a bit, 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 and keep going like that. And you get this very much some more patterned kind of exposures being created in your image, like you've taken 50 multiple exposures here. And then on the right hand side, you've got some movement vertically, and then you've got some really technical work called jiggling the camera at the end, which what that does then, it picks up any light sources and flickering in the leaves and starts to play with them in some shapes. So again, depending on the light sources and what the light's doing, you get you get integration between solid and light and patterns created based on your movements. So here's a really good example of showing you just 3 ways of taking a camera movement for trees and creating different types of outputs. And of course, in our lockdown, I guess the one thing we've all got availability to is a garden with some flowers, which have got, you know, or shrubs, or possibly over the garden fence into some trees or parkland, or the opportunity to go to a park and have a walk around. So this is not beyond anyone if you can get just a day of light. And again, the light doesn't matter because you can get moody images, or you can get, you know, bright images and more color and saturation out of them. And here's again as an example of one subject matter, which is kind of spiky leafy plants and shrubs, each one taken in different light, each one taken with different colors in those leaves, and then somewhat similar movement in cameras. But as you can see on the one on the left, you've got this kind of sort of staged movement a little bit going on, and in others you've got verticals and various other things. And what I will point out a little bit later is like this. I mean, how do you keep things pointed? So if you've got the one on the left, you've got a pointed end. And if you've got the kind of 3 in the middle, the points have gone, they've disappeared. They've disappeared into the color and the stripiness. And that comes from the difference between swiping down and swiping up. If you swipe up, you keep your points. If you swipe down, your points get filled in by the color and the structure that's beneath the point. So the direction at which you move your camera and the amount you move your camera and where you start and stop all matter. And depending on what you want out of it, you have to work on it. Now, one thing I will pose as a question to the committee is obviously we're in the competition. We're putting up individual images, right? What you're seeing from me here is an individual image, but it's made up of 5. Is that allowed? Are we allowed to put in a triptych of images in one image and call it one picture and one slide? I'm going to pose that as a question. Maybe the answer to that is no, because it's technically not an image and this is not a panel competition. But there is an opportunity. Obviously, this is post-production to create 5 images across the screen. So yeah, maybe the answer to it is a no, but we can answer that for definite at the end of the talk. Color, you know, I go on about color quite a lot when I'm talking in my talks, because I just think it's such a fantastic thing we have, and to use color as our subjects rather than particularly the objects. There is an opportunity with this type of creative work to use color, and in this one I'm kind of implying that this is kind of shocking. This is using camera movement, and it's a shock in terms of the color, and that is quite creative. So you're going to have to make a decision as to whether this stands up against stuff that's more intricate, or can color win the day up against other types of images if you do it well enough and interestingly enough. And that may be the case. Certainly color has something to play in the feeling of an image. And if you look at Turner's work, you'll most often see this warmth coming through in the tones he uses. And architecture is another great subject. And I'm going to help us all hopefully with our architecture evening as well, because I've got a section coming up on creative architecture. So maybe we can combine tonight's ideas into the architecture and put it into the architecture evening additionally. And this is one way of doing it, with buildings and camera movement, and the interesting mix of the blues you will get in the sky but the deeper tones of potentially a little bit of a sunrise coming up and how that reflects on buildings and the way the light plays. Creating this kind of, I kind of think, a little bit of a medieval look. One of the clear areas where we can really enjoy intentional camera movement is on the coast, because the seas and oceans create some unlimited sort of changing environments and tonalities which we can use to our advantage. So here we've got the warmth of wet sand at the base of the image. We've got the way the light's just playing, which is the surf coming in, and with a long enough exposure, that surf disappears from being surf and now becomes a patch of white, cool, kind of soft, fluffy wave or just surface. And surf, I mean, you might think I'm playing with dodging and burning here, and I'm creating, you know, bright areas. I may have done some dodging and burning, because we all should, but fundamentally the lightness here is coming from white surf, not from me just brightening everything up and taking all the color away. And then you've got obviously darker areas where you've got the waves moving, and as they start to curl or as they lift up, they get deep, the water gets deeper, the colors get darker, and you get areas of depth of color. And so this whole process enables you to create a depth to your image of light, dark, and different tonal areas in the photograph, which create more interest in it. So I want to show you some new work since the ICM presentation I did. This is using slower and less camera movement and faster shutter speeds. And what that does is it brings more structure back into the image. So suddenly now you can make out what we're looking at. We're looking at waves. It's not all merging into what I just described, sort of one big sort of area of white foam. Now we have sort of structured waves, and we have much more definition in the image. And you get a much clearer context and clarity to the view. And yeah, this for me creates another style of work, which is really quite fun and quite interesting, and I think comes out rather beautifully if you can get the right components into your photograph. And then if you take away the shoreline and you get into the water, now it looks like we've got a really sort of steamy, almost like a steamy bath with fog or wind or whatever coming in, or sort of taking advantage of a certain level of texture and layers coming into the image. And the more, again, you can find color tones in your image and start to move your camera so that you connect up darker patches with each other, you can actually get them to join together by your camera movement, and the amount of time you leave your camera over a dark or a light area. You can actually get areas that are separate to join up in your final image because of the way it burns into the sensor. And now you can get areas that are like, these are all greens and browns, and behind that is the blues. And then at the front, you've got some mauves and purples. And with just a little tweak on the saturation, you can bring those out as well. And again, you create another interesting, I think, style of work, and aesthetically quite warm and enjoyable. And you know, that it's amazing how sometimes those colors, I am not painting these pinks into this picture. This is not by me doing any post processing in terms of painting colors into this at all. This is all created by the camera, and obviously I do like to take people's eye through an image, so I will dodge and burn some areas sometimes to create eye travel around the image. But as you can see here, I mean, that's not an overt sort of you know, there's not an overt sort of line of light that I'm drawing here. These are created by the way the camera's working. So yeah, I think this is a really interesting and creative way of using your cameras and taking things on. And if we take from flowing water into flowing flora, you can take some of those things deeper into your flower work. And I mentioned earlier about about lighting. Again, really important. But with intentional camera movement, if you go on to spot metering and you meter for the areas that are dark or light within the image, you are going to change the way your camera exposes the work. And as long as you're swiping through darkness or swiping through generally light areas, your spot metering will hold, and you'll get this tonal light value changes in your image, and that will hold up. If you swipe horizontally across light, dark, then you're going to end up averaging your metering, because the way the metering is going to average over the time of the exposure, and you're going to get a very different effect. So if you want to enhance the light and dark contrast elements, you think about how you light the shot and where you're metering in your image, and how you take them, and you can get some really, really nice effects. And here, of course, this one again is bringing out the color and some of the shapes and structures. And as you can see here, this is much less of a continual swipe and more of a move the camera, move the camera, move the camera, move the camera. Maybe with some interim movement continuing, but you get a much more sort of repetition going on in your image when you work that way. And just to reconfirm, as I said earlier, if you want to keep your spikes, swipe in the direction of the spike, not from the spike into the solid of the color, or else you will bleed all of that solidity of your base of your tree or your flower into your spikes, and spikes will disappear. So to keep your spikes, carry on moving up. One thing with ICM that is a factor of the technique is that it's fundamentally two-dimensional. You're either swiping left to right or up to down, or, I mean, I know you can do wiggling around and everything else, but fundamentally you're moving in 2 dimensions. You're not moving in and out. So creating depth in your image needs work to understand how it's going to be and what kind of image will work on depth. So this is all about finding environments where there is puddles and patches of light that you can work with. And if you do that and you work your movement in sympathetic ways and not too dramatically, you can retain the 3-dimensionality that you see in an image like this. And also still to add these rather wonderful movement textures into your photograph. And then sort of finally, close up of everyday objects, familiar things, and then using the camera to take unusual scenes like this. I think this is very creative. I think this is really interesting. Not every judge is going to think that, but yeah, don't forget that you need to retain the principles of good photography in ICM work in terms of composition, color, simplicity, etc., etc. And if you can do that, you can create some really interesting creative things, as well as some very sort of interesting and dramatic new angles and perspectives on things. So that's a quick run through ICM for tonight. I want to move back to some real life stuff. I think there's space for creative work in everyday objects that we see, and as mentioned by Tillmans, he talked about the thingness of things, and Wolfgang Tillmans, and so if you take things that are everyday objects that we're all kind of familiar with, but you try to photograph the essence of that item, you're really sharing with people more of the feeling of the item than the actual item itself. So it might be about comfort or warmth or familiarity or something being out of place. So you're talking about the adjectives of the item, not the item itself to a degree. So, creative close-ups, I think, are really interesting. And you're all going to have lots of objects in the house. So if you can't get out, and I think there's a world of photography in your house of objects and lighting taken in interesting ways. And we all wish, I think, we could do this, which is visit our favorite coffee shop. And then, you know, you can find what I think are really quite nice types of photographs of color and shape that tell you, you know, from this photograph, I'm going to get the coffee shop wrong, but you know you're in Costa Coffee, or you know you're in Starbucks because of the decor, the color schemes. It's your place, you go to regularly. You know, it's good, you know that, and to some degree your audience will know that as well. I think that's a really interesting angle. And if you can get out again a bit more, then there's ways of taking new close-up angles of all sorts of things, like this, which make interesting close-ups. I've not done a lot of work on still life. It's something I want to do some more work on, but just getting a plant or objects. I know various camera club members are very good at this. Don't forget here, we can't add textures and do too much because that's not in camera creative, but just being creative with just some light, i.e. flash, and against a white background and isolating a subject. I think there's a lot of room for some creative still life work as well. So I think that's an area people could work on. Coming back to color and creativity, I think color is so powerful. If I put this image up, this is for me is an environmental portrait, in a sense, and the color is very punchy. So what is the subject here? Is it the kids or is it the color? I think photographically it's the color. Obviously content-wise, it's the kids, but there's definitely an angle here of creative photography in terms of how you compositionally lay out your subject, a bit of minimalism and negative space, and then this punchy color, and hopefully you capture your subject with some interesting moments in time as well alongside that, which I think maybe this is. So I think there's definitely an angle here. I'm not going to put too much of this stuff. I'm just going to show you this one because I want to get the idea across, because maybe it's not quite so easy for us to get out and about and do this kind of thing. But who knows? If you're in the park, you might be able to catch some animals and some people and stuff in this way. Long exposures. I need to talk about those because of the innate level of creativity that comes with it. I will say, though, that it's now become quite a common technique. As a club, we've gone through virtually everyone buying their 10-stop filter at some point over a range of about 6 outings we went on. Maybe it's a time to revive it and remind people what we can do. But I think it's a little less creative than it used to be. So I think we've got to find ways to raise it up, raise our game on long exposures. So here's a very basic long exposure of the sea and everything else. And it's not a fantastic photograph, and nor does the long exposure rescue it. And so I really wanted to make that point. We have to be careful about just using long exposures and thinking it's creative, because I'm not sure it is on its own back. And if the land is standing still and the sky is moving, there's something about clouds being creative. But again, even though this isn't a terrible kind of composition, nor is it a terribly great photograph. And if we look at something getting a little bit better, you know, and this is probably getting closer to the type of stuff we have been doing as club members over the years on numbers of outings. I still think this is okay, but it's still a bit safe. It's still a bit stale. And I think the best of this type of photography that maybe I've got that from this kind of era of doing this type of work is probably this type of thing, where you've got a much stronger kind of level of detail, but it's a simpler photograph. You've got some real shape to the photograph in terms of the way the eye is going to travel down here. You've got some fairly extreme length of exposure. I mean, you've got this kind of fluffy white stuff on the left-hand side. So yeah, I think if you get maybe more simple like this than purely a landscape, and a sort of landscape on, you know, the head of a rocks and the headland on a beach, I think that's getting stronger. But I think going more to something that's a little bit more classical, in trying to pull out an element of structure and composition is probably the stronger way to go for this creativity to get higher marks. And here we've got the softened sea through the long exposure and the pool of water. So on the left hand side, you've got a pool of water inside the like this break of created seawater pool, and on the outside you've got the sea, and you get the textural change between the two because of the size of the body of water and the way the wind is affecting the bigger body of water more. And you've got these contrast between the soft and the hard textures, the grainy sort of cement. I think these are stronger. And then of course you can introduce some really extreme or edgy compositions when you've got something a little bit more structured like this to work with than you do perhaps on a beach or in a lake or something. And of course you've got the glistening of the chrome in this case, which stands out nicely against the other textures. But I think you have to get compositionally a bit risky in order to pull in the high marks, and then brace yourself for a 6. And yeah, very long exposures, slightly foggy day, color, simplicity. This is another way to go if you're going to stick with the beach and the coastal stuff. And here we're looking at very simple compositions. We're looking at the way color changes and everything else. I think this is a creative way to go as well. And here we're looking at 30-second, 1-minute exposures, and taking advantage of the way the sea and the sky sort of mold together and all the colors. So yeah, that's what I think on long exposures for the moment. And I'm sure many of you have got other ideas which can add value. Mobile phone photography. Let's not forget that we carry our phones around with us all the time, and most of us have a camera on the phone, and or you can get hold of one. And it doesn't matter how good or bad your camera is on your phone, to be honest, because this is more snapshotty. This is more urgency and kind of capturing the essence of something. What's allowed and what's not allowed does need to be added in here. Hipstamatic and all the other kind of apps that come on your phone are not allowed. That's the same as using these things we talked about earlier, like in-camera art filters and stuff. So you can't use your textured apps and your fancy borders and all that stuff that comes with mobile phones. Big shame. Hopefully we can do that another day. But your mobile phone will come with potentially apps which look like they're wide angle lenses or other things like that, and that's a much more normal use of your mobile. And I think you can get away with that as long as it's not overtly messed around with. Please ignore the odd fancy border, therefore, on 1 or 2 pictures I'm going to share with you, because that's not what I'm asking you to think about and look at. But you can get shallow depths of field with a mobile phone, and you can and the square format quite often will work for you. And I don't see any problem if you're saturating and or going monochrome, that a little bit of desaturation might help. and so you can get quite creative with your mobile phone. And you can also do intentional camera movement with your mobile phone. If you're going to do that, though, you don't have control over shutter speed like you do on your normal camera. So you need to be very fast with your phone, and you probably go into an area where there's low light, and your phone will automatically therefore extend the exposure time, shutter speed, slow that down, and your faster movement will get a bit of movement. But what you can expect is something like this, where you can still see the shape and texture of what you're doing. But I think this can make a really interesting and creative portrait. And going back to snapshot photography, I mean, who could have invented these characters? I think I've shown this picture before in the club, but you know, the phone does some really interesting stuff. And if you can capture interesting people in interesting poses, you know, I think that's quite creative, and I'll leave you to think about that. The other thing, another area I think is interesting is mirrors and reflections for your creativity. Obviously, we can do you know, light patterns in reflections are always interesting. So that's something you can work with, whether you're moving a camera, whether it's multiple exposure or straight, they're all quite good. But even with a mobile phone, you've got a graininess based on, you can, in some apps, change the ISO effectively and get grainy outputs. And I've got a section on, a very short section, just talking about grain, because I think that's, again, a creative area. So here we've got, you know, Jean-Paul Gaultier sort of cologne from the 90s, and a mirror, a shaving mirror, and the graininess, I think, adds to that kind of that era look of the photograph. So I think it's quite interesting. And of course, you may not be able to get out and about so much to see this type of opportunity, but you know, mirrored walls, mirrored ceilings also create for some really interesting creativity. And going to exhibitions. I mean, this is Tate Modern, but what's interesting here is this obviously is two photographs, but do you take the one which is on the left, which is giving you like a window and a framing of something interesting, but from a different angle? Or do you wait for someone to walk into the photograph who's wearing a shirt of the same color as the exhibits in the room, and you know, you can see what that does with your image. So yeah, I think reflections come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and guises from different locations that you can take advantage of in your photography and create some interesting creative work. And just completing the kind of the special techniques with multiple exposures. Obviously, multiple exposures enable you to create patterns and geometric shapes like we have here, that you're in control of by overlaying the patterns in the way you want, and then making something interesting from the stuff that kind of overlaps and merges. So I think there's some interesting areas there. And of course, if you get into something that's already patterned, and you can move your camera or rotate your camera around an axis, axes, then you can create this really interesting sort of geometry that is less freeform and more structured and symmetrical, geometric as an output, which I think is interesting. And then stuff that's less is more freeform and less structured, is things like this, where you've got a reflection on a textured wall or something that you can then combine the reflection with the texture on the wall as a shadow, and work with that in your multiple exposures. So again, this is this combination of fine textures, use different combinations, in this case shadow work and multiple exposure work, and put the two together. The more traditional stuff in landscapes looks like this. I think quite difficult to get something which is stunning. but it is interesting, and there are some interesting shapes and patterns and colors and lights you can get. And the same with flower work, using multiple exposures to move your camera around, get these overlaps and get the tones of colors and lights changing the way when you do it, and creating a different shapes out of it. I did mention about contextual stuff, and here's an example of seeing one object and working with another object, photographing them, and you can see the contextual contrast. To what extent that is creative, I think it is, but maybe it's not going to be interpreted all that well in a creative competition. I'll leave you to make that decision. I'm not going to show you too many more of these images, but just to see the idea with you that you can use that kind of work. I do think minimalism is an interesting area. And coming back to our very long exposure work, if you get a big expanse of land or sea or park or whatever, a very, very long exposure gives you this emptiness, because certainly some things will move through the scene, and because your exposure is so long, it won't record them if they're quick. So you could lose a vehicle, for example, in a photograph because it runs through the image that quick. If your image is exposed for a minute, then a vehicle crossing it in 5 seconds almost will disappear. So you have an opportunity there. Alternatively, in just straight photography, you have the opportunity to create a real sense of isolation and minimalism with straight photography. And then your decision whether that minimalism is enough, or whether you need something like a fence, or in this case, 3 people and a dog, the size of a pinhead, to break the minimalism and give that point of interest. That's your decision. And you can also apply that to things that are much more sort of close up, like this type of thing, where you're looking at textures and you're really kind of here pushing your composition. Can you get away with a very, very aggressive composition and it still work? And I'll leave you to be the judge of that. I did promise you some architecture, so I just want to run through architecture, because I think this has got some real creative opportunity as well as for architecture. We've all seen this type of photograph, and I think it is quite interesting. I don't think it's going to win any prizes though, and it's all about where how you expose it to some degree, and light and shade. But I think there's more value here in identifying negative space and interesting architectural things that kind of impact the negative space. And also you'll notice here, this is framing as well. So the shape of the aspect ratio of the photograph kind of mirrors the shape of the framing of this glass window that it then holds your subject matter and the geometry within it. And so you've got layers of geometry with the aspect ratio of the photograph, the aspect ratio of the framing in the photograph, and then the subject underneath. And I think those layers of framing and symmetry really speak to your creativity. Now, I'm going to tell you how to cheat. If you want to warm your photograph up, you don't necessarily have to do it in post-processing. You can actually do it by changing your color balance in your camera before you start. So if you use the wrong color balance, your camera will take the photograph thinking it's cloudy or daylight or tungsten, and actually come out with a tinted image. So that's a tip for how to cheat on pre-post processing, if you like, by setting your camera up to give you a tinted image. And so that's for you to experiment and see. I don't have a list of which color balances will give you which results, unfortunately, but go have fun with that one and see what you come up with. But I quite like these very, very clean and kind of geometric things with the warmth of the color tone coming through on this type of photograph. And then to the contrary of that, if you go the other way, you can get a really cool image, and using reflections, using lines, and using the color context that we've come up with here, I think that creates an interesting creative opportunity. You know, and this is a slightly more straight version of that type of thing, looking at buildings, and then this type of thing where you're creating an impression of a reflection when actually it's the corner of a building, and it's the light playing differently from the different angles that create the symmetry for you and create the idea that this is a reflection when actually it isn't. But I think there's a lot of angles here for creativity. And of course, if we combine our ICM with our building structures and we have a good play with this, we can start to get light and dark in different areas of the image and get some really interesting, what is soft textures on a really hard subject. And of course, that creates a kind of psychological engagement, because you expect a building to be hard, and yet this is soft, and yet you can see there's hard lines in here. So I think the use of light and all that is really quite interesting. Very quick run on grain, as I've mentioned, using very high ISO to get grainy black and whites and putting that on subjects which you don't expect to see it on, for me is a highly creative kind of direction. And of course you can always put it into subjects that are kind of old and are kind of normal for this type of grain effect. And whether you're using film or whether you're using digital high ISO, you can get some interesting outputs. I'm not sure this last one actually takes you to a strong creative place, but it does certainly, it does give you some ideas of what to do. Right, a couple of areas I want to finish up with tonight as we come to the last 5 minutes or so of tonight's talk, is I really think it would be remiss not to talk about analog. And so I want to suggest that you can get out your Polaroid cameras, get out your film cameras, take photographs with them, scan them, and do some really interesting work. This is a Polaroid, or it's actually an Impossible project pre-Polaroid instant image, and is a flower, obviously is a still life flower. But I just love the organic way that you see the imperfections in the surface of the image through this, just the medium of the photography, and then scan it in. And I will say I've done some touching up on this to make it crisp and white and everything else. And of course, when you're photographing or scanning an object, it's really hard to get rid of all the dust. But I would suggest that it's okay in this image to do your post-processing in the sense of cleaning up an image. I don't think anyone's going to criticize you for that. So there's a little bit of work done there. And you have a choice. You can obviously get rid of your Polaroid border that is part of this image and just turn it into this if you want to, with no border. So that's an option for you. But I think this is a beautiful thing that's really difficult to create in digital, because it's done through analog and light and chemistry, right? And here's another example, very, very simple Polaroid photography. And I want to just take you to the edge of this for any brave people out there that want to try a Polaroid Fuji Instax emotion lift. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. This is a piece of very heavyweight photographic paper in these squares, and then you take the Polaroid photograph and you strip the back off, and you just take the emulsion that's in the sandwich of the kind of plastic front and the backing, and you can float this off in warm water and then drop it onto a piece of plain paper. And the top right is as you will all have done at one point in your life, press the button on your Polaroid camera and it comes out blank. And if you then do an emotion lift on a blank piece of Polaroid film, you get this kind of thing. And what I love about it is the organic nature of the shapes you can make, because this is all done by you, how it ends up in terms of this structure and the shape. And you can see the one on the bottom is a photograph of and these are black and white ones. I mean, you can do it in color. And the way you need to do it, and anyone that's interested, I can give you some YouTube links. You take the image, you put your Polaroid, get some trays of warm and cold water, you get your scissors, you cut round the frame, basically cutting the seal of the packaging of your Polaroid. You can peel off the backing layer. It's normally a kind of black, horribly dark blue black thing. You drop this thing in water, you can peel off the front plastic, and you're left with this emulsion that will float in the water. You then, once you've separated these off, you slide your piece of clean, very thick paper, because it's going to get wet, underneath the Polaroid image. You use a little paintbrush to brush your image back onto your paper. You slowly slide it out, drop it into cold water. This kind of lets it form against the paper. Pull it all out, brush it, all the wrinkles away with your brush, leave it to dry, and that's what you get. If I take this photograph, which I put into a Camera Club exhibition 10 years ago, I then photographed that photograph and then Polaroid lifted it onto this piece of paper, and that's what I got. And if I take this photograph that I took, which many of you will recognize a number of years ago, photograph that with a Polaroid camera, lifted that off. Again, I happened to be working in black and white with these, so that's why the emotion lifts are all black and white. This is the emotion lift, which I then cropped into the image to give you this output. So if you guys want to get really creative, you're gonna take a photograph, you're gonna handle the photograph, you're gonna use it and complete intervention manually with it and come out with this rather fantastic output. And finally, I just want to share with you, not all photographs are designed to be in focus. And if you want to go and have fun and just find things in the world, that's a lampshade. A lampshade top left-hand corner with the angles, and then the base of the lamp, somebody's beautifully done that with some cloth, which is why it's soft and colored. But that's fundamentally half a lampshade on the left-hand side of a picture here. And here we have a bowl of, I can't remember, cherries, raspberries, something like that, purposely completely out of focus to give you this very, very soft and kind of creative angle on your work. And so, yeah, I think that's the ultimate in just doing what the hell you like with something interesting, and it's then you to play with the colors, the light, the shapes, and everything else. So with that, I'll say to everybody with 1 minute left, good luck in the competition, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
That was a real tour de force of but everything you could possibly imagine with being creative with your camera and various other bits and pieces besides. So I don't think there's any excuse whatsoever amongst the membership that's been on this call tonight for not being able to think of what to do for one picture